Hello and welcome to an I'm feeling myself kind of day. This past semester that I endured, fall 2015, was a semester from hell. And in order to honor my struggle and bury this semester farther into the ground where it belongs, closer to hell, I'm gonna talk about all the books I read for my classes. Firstly, I am in my third year of a gender studies and political science degree. The first class I'm going to talk about is a class I took on Indigenous politics on Canada, and the first book we read for that one is This Is Not a Peace Pipe, Towards a Critical Indigenous Philosophy by Dale Turner. So Dale Turner is an Indigenous academic who in this book basically provides a really scathing critique of Canadian liberalism and basically how efforts that have been made largely by the government and other academics to address the situation in Canada have basically been just trying to subsume Indigenous people as a kind of minority group within the existing system without trying to actually dismantle the system. So I like this book because he does provide a really solid critique. However, like a lot of other critiques that we read of this book in class, I don't think that he really goes far enough. He is very much about a little bit more reformative change, kind of still working within structures. And for that reason, I really enjoyed the next book that we read, which was Lighting the Eighth Fire, The Liberation, Resurgence, and Protection of Indigenous Nations, which is edited by Leanne Simpson with many, many wonderful contributors. So this book is amazing. I love this book so much. I love Leanne Simpson. She is very much about transformative politics and moving farther beyond than any critique that Dale Turner put forward, and focusing largely on transformative change outside of existing structures, because she operates under the baseline assumption that I agree with, which is that transformative change can never come from within an oppressive institution. The next class that I was in was basically a feminist analysis of nationalism in India. So looking at the ways in which masculinity and femininity have been impacted by globalization, historical gender roles, all that kind of stuff. So the first book we read for that one was Dwelling in the Archive, Women Writing House, Home, and History in Late Colonial India by Antoinette Burton. So the point of reading this book and what Burton is trying to argue is that there's a difference between the official archive and the unofficial archive. So the official archive is all the stuff that we consider to be official documentation of history, like census reports, political party statements and manifestos, data, that kind of stuff. And that's what remains in the very masculinized public sphere. But what she is arguing is that there is an unofficial archive, which is made up of things like novels and cookbooks and memoirs, family histories, which are largely contributed to by women and are therefore overlooked and devalued because it's feminized. Once we establish that the unofficial archive is a thing and that it's important to look at because it has a lot of valuable insight into lots of things within history, we got to look at our first novel, which was Cracking India by Bapsi Sidhwa. And a lot of the reason that I really like this is because it's the first time I ever got to analyze and read a novel for school. This book is told from the perspective of Lenny, who is a young Parsi girl living in India during partition. There's a lot of symbolism in this book, and I love it, particularly in how, especially with gender relations, and how her nanny is a very beautiful woman who has lots of suitors and friends, and how all those male friends are supposed to represent specific types of masculinity that's tied to different religions. The second last book that I read for that class was The Making of Neoliberal India, Nationalism, Gender, and the Paradoxes of Globalization by Rupal Oza, and I loved this book. This book was great because it was nonfiction, obviously, but it was so readable and accessible. Loved it, and it was all about the transformations of masculinity and femininity in new globalized India. The last book that I read for that class was another novel, and that is The Space Between Us by Tirti Umrigar. Sorry. This book, in my opinion, was the better novel, and I enjoyed it more because I read it like after the class ended. We didn't actually end up talking about it a lot in class, so I was able to just enjoy it and not as like try to analyze it as much. but it is a really, really beautiful book. It talks a lot about gender and class relations specifically, because the main character is Bhima, who is a working class woman, and she's raising her granddaughter who is in college, and she's supposed to be breaking the cycle of poverty that Bhima's family has lived in for generations, but then she ends up getting pregnant. She is working for a very wealthy family she's part of their family in a way because she's worked there for so long and they are quite good to her, but they're very like upper class wealthy Parsi family. And my prof for the class just really likes the author and she loves this book in particular, but one of the reasons she said she wanted us to read it is because it gives a case study, I guess, or a smaller example of a larger problem within international feminist movements, is that there has been an inability to actually have a very kind of unified transnational feminism, because there's always something stopping women who live in different situations and experience different types of privilege and oppression from actually unifying and uniting. Like, there's always been issues with being able to overcome those. The last class I'm going to talk about was a class called Gender, Nation, and War. And this is the class, as I talked about in my Penelope video, that basically introduced me to the idea of a feminist study of nationalism. So we read a lot of stuff for that class that was incredible and difficult and made me weep inside, and the emotional labor was real. But one of the two books that we read was Dark Threats and White Nights, The Somalia Affair, Peacekeeping and the New Imperialism by Shireen Razak, who I have talked about during Can Month actually. And so what Razak is doing in this book is she is arguing that Canada's imagining of itself as a nation of peacekeepers, both historically, because a lot of the colonial myth in Canada is that settlers showed up and like sorted out all the problems that Indigenous people had because they were just inherently irrational and not real people, and how that imagining is used to situate Canada outside of history so we don't have to address or look at or think about our actual colonial and violent past, and therefore we are seen through an ahistorical lens, which is really fucked up. And so she is using the specific instance of like modern day peacekeeping efforts, particularly the Somalia affair. The last book I'm going to talk about, and the one that was definitely my favorite book of the semester, is Nemo's War, Emma's War, Making Feminist Sense of the Iraq War by Cynthia Enloe. Cynthia Enloe is just, God bless. Most of her work is focused around like gender, war, international relations. What this book taught me is that it's not that I hate international relations, it's that I hate how it's studied in political science, because I've always hated international relations when I take it in the political science department because it's used with the security focus, which focuses on things like kill ratio, soldiers as being heroes and how many of them we need, treaties and international agreements, if it's lawful, if it's a just war, like those kinds of very masculinized understandings of how the world works and relations between countries. Whereas a feminist lens really looks at like whose security are we fighting for, analyzing the discourse and discussions around war, looking at whose security improves and decreases over time. How do gender relations change? Is there an increase in gender-based violence during wartime? Yes, always. Those kinds of questions. And the feminist lens isn't supposed to completely supplant the security lens. It's just supposed to work with it to broaden our discussions and understandings of war and international relations. So anyway, this specific book is looking at the Iraq War. And so what Cynthia Enloe did is she talks about all the different gendered phases of the Iraq War from the perspectives and studies of 2 Iraqi women and then 2 American women. And looks at the idea that Canada and the US went into Afghanistan and Iraq with the idea and rhetoric that we were going to liberate the oppressed Iraqi, Afghani women, which is because that's starting under the assumption that Canadian women aren't oppressed and everything's all good here and we're therefore in a position to liberate other women. Also assumptions about the ways in which Afghani and Iraqi women were oppressed. One of the things that Enloe points out is that the security and status of women decreased significantly during the Iraq War. to the point where it's now at the level where young women in Iraq have less education than their mothers. Like, we're actually, like, ugh, ugh. And so basically talking about how stuff like that is bullshit, and she looks at recruiting processes and how that's done, and just intersectional analysis all around. It's beautiful. Beautiful. Loved it. Loved reading it. I felt like I was reading this for fun, almost. I hope this was at least mildly entertaining. I really like hearing about what other people are reading and studying for school and their degrees and that kind of stuff. So let me know if you'd like to hear more about these books, I guess, or, you know, other stuff related to school. That's it. Bye. Oh god, this look got me ready to stay home and drink Baileys out of the bottle.